Hello and welcome to episode 2 of the Verbal to Visual podcast. I am your host, Doug Neal, and in this episode, you're going to get to hear Ellen Mann and I chat about bringing your full creative self to your work, something that I think sketchnoting is particularly well suited for. And we're going to dig into the specific question of how sketchnoting can support your writing. I'm excited about that intersection. You can find the show notes for today's episode at verbaltovisual.com/2. Let's get into it. Welcome, Ellen. Thanks so much for joining us today. I figured to kick things off, I will throw it to you for just kind of a general introduction. Let us know who you are, where you're coming from, and kind of generally the role that you would like sketchnoting to play in your life.
Okay. Well, I have a long career in advertising as a creative director and copywriter. And right now I did a long stint at Wells Fargo as a creative director, and I left there and came back as a consultant, as a creative consultant, and then just took a lower job just as a copywriter. I'm teamed up with a great art director who was also a creative director at one point. And what got me into the whole visual learning was when Wells Fargo was going through the meltdown where their brand was just going in the toilet. My boss, the executive creative director, said to me, "Why don't you just doodle up some ideas we can put into testing?" And I heard the word doodle and I just, like, something in my brain lit up. And at that point, I mean, I always wanted to be a New Yorker cartoonist, but never had the talent to draw. So I literally did this ad of just long, oblong circles, like one after the other, which was supposed to represent a line of people. And I put the headline over it, and he was like, "Great, let's, comp it up and put it into testing." And that became a pivotal moment in my life of, I have to pursue this. And so it started with Back of the Napkin, Dan Rome, and then I kind of found my way to you. I did some cartoons. So long story short, where I want to go with this is maybe it's some version of cartooning, also helping other creative people get to the gist of the idea of a concept or to execute the concept. I just think, and for taking notes, because for me, I can't understand pages and pages. So I have read books like you do and just kind of gotten to the bottom line of what it is that the book is trying to say. So it's kind of, I know it's challenging because I'm sort of this hybrid person in sketchnoting and in life. I don't fall into one compartment. I kind of cross lines.
Well, that is very cool, Ellen. There are a lot of interesting pieces already, just to that little kind of snippet of your history, how you made your way into this world, and also where you want to go with it. And I think, touching on the most recent thing you mentioned there, I feel like a lot of the listeners will resonate with that piece of having these different sides or aspects to your personality and your creative work, and wanting to play in a few different worlds and being able to see how this visual note-taking thing can be a really meaningful activity in different worlds. So I think that those two applications that you mentioned can play really well together for the, individual note-taking that you want to do for yourself. And I'm almost seeing already, and you're probably doing this, that can be like a testing ground for maybe the work that you might do in helping other creators get to the gist of the concept and then kind of execute on it. I think those can play really well together. I also think it's really cool when you were talking about the situation at Wells Fargo. how someone, even just using the phrase like doodle up some ideas,
Mm-hmm.
I feel like even just hearing that is like almost progressive in my mind, at least in a big organization like that, to use the word doodle in that way, um, which is just encouraging to me that it was used in that almost like non-derogatory type way that some folks have been exposed to or potentially chided for in school or something like that, thinking that
Huh.
doodling is not a useful thing to do. So I think that's a cool backstory. I share a similar, dream at times of making New Yorker cartoons. I think that's pretty awesome. Um, so I think it's really interesting how you've made your way into this world and exciting the applications that you have in mind. From there, where do you feel like where would you describe your kind of like current state within this world as far as how you're feeling about your skills, kind of what you're up to right now, and maybe some like specific questions that we can explore in our conversation here.
I think where it gets blurry for me is the idea of illustration versus communication.
Mm.
And then I find myself at times, because I'm a writer, I use a lot of words, and there's nothing wrong with words. When you're interested in a subject, words come in handy. But too many words and just, a few stars and a bubble, just sort of loses some of the punch. And yet some of those words really provide a clearer context, or maybe I'm not even getting it right because I'm so used to writing.
Mm.
So those boundaries, like how can I cut back a little on the writing and make the graphics or the doodles or the whatever work a little harder, but don't ask me to give up all my words.
Yeah, I do feel like that is kind of like a almost ever present tension that I feel like I often feel as well, in terms of like I often think of it as this like spectrum from verbal to visual. That's part of the reason I like named my project in this way, in the fact that you kind of get to play around within any given set of notes or any given poster that you're making or illustration that you're doing or sketchnote illustration. You kind of get to decide
Mm-hmm,
how verbal to make it and how visual to make
mm-hmm,
it. And I think this is where like experimentation can pay a lot of dividends. And it really does get at both of the pieces that you mentioned, like distinguishing between illustration and communication. Um, you know, illustration is some form of communicating, but obviously it's much more, it leans on those heavily visual tools. And when I think of communication, it would be fun to try to like bring in some examples of each. Because I think on the communication side, I think Dan Rome, you mentioned already in Back of the Napkin,
mm-hmm.
he's a great example of leaning into the communicative powers of doodling.
Yeah.
And, I haven't looked at Dan Rome's like full body of work, but I don't think any of his work would be described as illustration.
No.
uh, but it's like very powerful communication. And on the illustration side, I think of even it's fun talking about the New Yorker, like seeing some of the illustrated um, kind of featured images for a given article. They really lean into the illustrative side of things, but often there's still some words or phrases embedded. There can be a lot that's communicated within those illustrations.
Mm-hmm,
Yeah, I'm just thinking about almost it being like a case by case basis of deciding
mm-hmm,
which, because I also feel like I should point out that in my experience too, sometimes it's the phrase it's the phrasing and like the cadence of a sentence that lends its power. So I encourage folks to, be on the lookout for those times when it is the words that carry some of the weight and the meaning and the importance for you, because that is another way of helping you to remember and then act on those ideas.
Hmm.
Um, so what I'm trying to like kind of arrive at, and maybe we can try to get there together, is what sort of like decision tree we can follow or you can follow to help you decide when you might want to lean in on the words, and other times when you might want to lean more onto the kind of illustrative components of it. And other times maybe when they might go really well together.
Mm-hmm.
To get more specific and kind of less abstract and theoretical, is there anything that you're working on right now, as far as like a information source that you're sketching out, or an idea that you've been playing around with to try to bring in a specific example?
Yes, I read a book called I think it's Life Reimagined. It's Richard Leiter. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. And I forget the other guy's name. I think he helped start Fast Company. Uh, anyway, I loved the book because we all go through stages in our journeys, right? Where we go, this isn't working, but I'm not sure
Mm.
what to do next. And so I mapped out visually the
Nice.
journey of the book. And I was showing to a friend, and she was like, "Oh my God, that's so great." And I thought, this is what I want to kind of build a book around because of my own personal experience and my own different legs of a journey. I think that the process that they point out is so valuable. And so I wanted to do this book where I tell stories, I offer up a process, and then I go deeper into the process by using a map and then explaining
Mm.
that the map is not the territory, right? You can look at a map and go, oh, got it. And then you get there and you're like, oh, there's traffic and there's an accident. It's
Mm.
not at all. It's totally different. But as long as you understand that there will be those periods in your mapping that are not necessarily going to be fun, or maybe they will be unexpectedly enjoyable. So that this content, the book that I want to do is sort of like, it's not going to be an ordinary book. It's going to be a combination. The closest I can get is like a Dan Rome, but not quite as leaning so heavily on the visuals, but having them punch up the content in key areas so that the
Mm-hmm.
learning becomes so graspable.
Yeah, I mean, I love that. Kind of organizing structure of this map that kind of gives the reader a sense for the journey that they're going to go on, but it's maps are necessarily uh, scaled down and somewhat abstract, and they don't depict what the person going on that journey is actually going to see at any given point along it.
Right.
Um, and what that kind of brings to mind for me is a potential way to think about the distinction between kind of leaning heavier on illustration versus words, is thinking about if there are stories that you're telling
Mm-hmm.
within this book, and then potentially even for the reader going through, thinking about when will it be most helpful to like paint a clear picture of like a single moment in time to really help anchor that story. So it's almost like, are there times when you actually do want to like represent the territory in some way, or like a case study of someone's territory to shed light on a specific situation to help the reader have a similarly like close view at their situation.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that like one potential way to look at when to go heavy on the illustration is when either you want to communicate that level of detail that you can't get with words. If you want to communicate that to your reader and or encourage the reader to take a similarly detailed look at, you know, a particular scene in their life or in their past or what the case may be. Um, how does that hit you as an idea?
I love it. I love it. I've started to actually, I wrote the introduction, and it's really about my older son,
Mm,
and the feelings of anger and frustration he went through when he was very young, and sadness. And it was really, we discovered a gap in learning between his intelligence, which was very high, and his ability to execute the intelligence on paper. And so
mm,
that frustration was enormous. And I literally could, see that gap, right? Like the little
mhm,
illustration of the little guy, looking at the gap, looking at that big hole in the ground that he has
mm,
to cross somehow. So some kind of bridge has to be built. And it was getting an art tutor to show him,
hmm,
to help him with his fine motor skills. And what's so interesting, Doug, is that a few years later, for an art project, he drew sections of the human skeleton that are outstanding. Everyone was like,
hmm,
oh my gosh. And that, like 10 years later, 15 years later, he became a physical therapist,
hmm.
right? So,
That's so cool.
right? It's sort of like what was inside of him needed to come out. And doing
Hmm,
it on paper with a pen or a pencil or a stylus allows that, right? Because you kind of tap into your intuition of what's drawing you to the, what needs to come out for you to get it.
right.
So that was an example of kind of a little snippet, but
Hmm,
that it's really resonating. And now that you're saying that, I just kind of flashed on a beginning that I may want to shift a little bit. That when in the Reimagine book, he actually has a couple graphs that are pretty ugly. They could be simplified. That are just how
mm,
we picture our life story, which is sort of like this bell curve upside down, right? And
mm, yep,
it's
yep.
like when you get old, forget about it. And I'm 63, so even though I feel very young, I've been through a lot.
Mm,
So when he shows the news story, it's more of just a light signal wave that just goes up and down throughout life, and maybe it dips a little at the end. But it's a different way of looking at your life story or your life journey. And just those visuals, you just kind of like, that's it, right?
mhm.
That's it. You don't have to say it in words. You just look at it and you go, yeah.
Yeah. No, I like that. I'm appreciating too the kind of like the variety of visual and verbal tools that you have at your disposal that I'm kind of, you know, imagining you weaving into this book of yours kind of you know, throughout the text because I do really enjoy both of those, right? I like, you know, the narrative prose of reading paragraphs and like getting into that flow,
Yep.
but then at appropriately spaced times, like a helpful diagram or like a big quote that's made bold for you or some more illustrated scene. And even just kind of identifying maybe like what those categories are that you might want to weave in. We've talked so far about like the illustrative pieces. You just mentioned more kind of like diagrams, which are very helpful. You know, some sort of a timeline, or even like your map is a form of diagram, or you know, process flow charts. Thinking about ways people maybe have seen like the hero's journey depicted,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
things like that. And then other times when maybe you just want to uh, maybe still sketch out, use some hand lettering elements to, give a powerful phrase most of a page when you want those words to stick out. Um, so yeah, kind of just knowing that you have those options available to you, I think is powerful. And my sense, I feel like this kind of came up in a previous conversation that kind of once you've identified those types of options that you might want to pull from, my sense is that with any given chapter or portion of your book or story that you're telling, it's probably clear. You'll probably have an intuitive sense for like which of those is the best fit to provide some additional support, additional emphasis for that section of the book or that set of ideas. Do you feel like as you're thinking about, the types of stories that you might want to tell in this book, and um, do you feel like that will be kind of intuitive decision making for you, having identified those categories and maybe a couple others that you might want to include?
Oh, that's kind of interesting. So when you talk about categories, you mean sort of like looking at the stories or the outline and determining, like, oh, this is a story. Here's where I might want to have some visuals, like kind of mapping the chapters.
Yeah, and maybe for each chapter. So when I mentioned categories, I was thinking of things like, maybe illustration as one category,
Ah,
diagram as a second category,
yep.
hand lettered quote as a third category. And if you wanted to include some others, you could. But having like those,
Yes.
a relatively finite list of those
Oh, good. Yeah.
that you could choose from within each chapter or within each section. Uh, and that would give, and you don't have to be like too strict with yourself, obviously, as you're bringing those in to kind of break up the text from time to time. But I could see the reader enjoying, coming across those different styles of visual representations at first, seeing each category for the first time and being like, oh, this is a cool way to like represent this thing that I'm just reading. And then as they continue through the book, they see those consistencies in terms of, oh, there's also like a mix of some illustrations, each of which have kind of maybe a somewhat consistent style to them. And then these diagrams that are also really helpful that have, consistent diagram elements. I could see the reader appreciating both the variation in those visual supports, but then also the consistency within the category.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
for me, it's just kind of fun to think about that. Uh, you're almost like creating a style guide
Yeah.
for your book
Yeah. Yeah.
in terms of the elements that you want to bring in, and that's fun to think about because then you have this yeah, a set of tools and an approach that, as I'm thinking about it, at least makes the writing of the book and the developing of those visuals. It almost like it feels like it gives you a head start, like you've got a jumping off point. Um,
Right.
so that's kind of what I had in mind when I was mentioning categories.
No, that's really good because part of, I've tried many, many attempts to write books and it's too boring. I cannot, it's just there has to be a funner element, which is like
Mm,
advertising. There's just other components in it that isn't just
mm,
words and lots of
right.
words. It's like, oh my God, shoot me.
Yeah, well, and I think that too gets back to what you mentioned, kind of at the very beginning of this conversation about, having different aspects of your personality or kind of wanting to bring your full self to this work.
Yes.
I think that like giving yourself the permission to have those combination of elements, like in addition to the prose that you're writing, and based on the history that you've described, like you've got experience in both of those realms with your copywriting skills and, interest in New Yorker cartoons and all that. So, bringing your full self to the book in that way, it just feels more powerful. And I think too, to like broaden it to like sketchnoting in general, I think that's what one of the things that makes it appealing for folks, even just as a note-taking tool, is that it allows you to bring, I think, more of yourself and this broader creative skill set to whatever it is you're working with. And that just makes it a more interesting and more engaging experience when you do that.
I wonder, just, I don't know if you know the answer to this, but just production wise, like how, I loved Notability, by the way. It's so
Mm,
cool.
yeah, it's a cool app.
It's so intuitive.
Yeah.
It's just like, oh my gosh, I could figure it out, because I'm always afraid I'm going to break something, or I don't know, screw it up. Um, do you know, is there, in the self-publishing world, not that I'm going to go, how you would do that? Would you need to, type most of it in, and then sort of insert? Or would you literally have to write it by hand?
So the way I've taken some brief looks at, what it looks like to self-publish a book,
Yep.
and this was a while ago, so it could be even easier and more intuitive right now. But for self-publishing, I one way that can happen is through a tool like Adobe's InDesign,
Uh-huh.
which you might have seen or be
Yep.
familiar with, that uh, allows you to weave together typed text, and you can pull in images as well.
Yeah.
So I think what that like production process would look like is probably for you, like deciding what is the tool that you want to use for those visuals,
Yeah.
for the illustrations,
Yeah.
and ideally, pick one tool that maybe allows you to get at all of the categories that you want to include,
Mm-hmm.
just so that you don't have to get familiar with a bunch of different tools.
Yeah.
And I am almost 100% sure that any of the note-taking apps like Notability, they would allow you to export a high enough quality visual to
Yeah.
then put into that InDesign document, so that even when you go to do something like self-publish, um, uh, you can see that high quality image both in like the, if you wanted to do a print on demand version of it, and then also within like uh, the Kindle view or the
Mm-hmm.
e-reader view.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
that's where I think in the early days, those e-readers did not do visuals their justice, but I'm guessing it's gotten to the point where even kind of no matter what e-reader you're using, that uh, those detailed images will still look good, and the experience of reading and then coming across an image and being able to zoom in on that image, like I have the sense that that's all running pretty smoothly now, and that wouldn't be too much of a hurdle to for you to figure out if you wanted to kind of do all that yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. Good recommendation. I think that makes total sense. All these things are popping in my head as you're talking. I'm like, yeah, I'm writing this. Thank you. It's really,
It's exciting.
yeah.
I'm excited about what you're up to.
Yeah. I mean, I just want to make sure that I'm enjoying the process. It can't feel
Mm.
like, it can't feel like work with work. And I know there's a certain amount of work or focus. I prefer to call it that, but
Yeah.
that's, I don't want it to feel like a grueling sludge. It's
Right.
not, I'm not interested. So it's got to have a little bit of fun and kind of like, ooh, that's cool.
Yeah. Yeah. A little bit of that spark there.
Mhm.
And I think that's a great way to approach it as well. And to almost, whatever your process looks like for spending time and working on this, making sure that that spark, that enjoyment is built into the process. Uh, Especially since it is, it's not your full-time work, right?
No.
It's a side
Yes.
project. So to have the uh, kind of build up and then maintain this kind of long-term momentum with it, I think that enjoyment is a big part of the process, or weaving that into the process.
Yeah.
Um, and I think, this is another thing that I feel like I see come up with many folks who get into sketchnoting, the desire to write a book and self-publish a book, is or even try to get it traditionally published.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So there's things going on in the back of my mind now too around you know uh, writers who draw, or this intersection of writing and
Yes.
sketchnoting
Yes.
has always been very intriguing to me. And I'm waiting for the right time, like personally within my work and life and all this, to be able to like pursue that intersection myself more intently, but then bring other folks like you and anyone else who also is interested in that intersection of sketchnoting and writing, and maybe create some sort of a space where we can do all that together, to make sure we're having fun in the process and learning from each other, and
Yes.
building those pieces in.
Love it. Love it. I'm like, go. I'm so glad I stumbled on you, because it really, I so think you're doing a great job with simplifying and just teaching. You're just an amazing teacher, and your curriculum is so well organized and simple and fantastic, really.
Well, thank you, Ellen. I very much appreciate it. And I really much have enjoyed our conversation here.
Me too.
And feel free to, well, we've got the online classroom environment to stay in touch if you want to reach out in the future and share how things are going. And maybe at some point we can hop on another call too to chat about what's going on.
Yeah, that sounds terrific. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Ellen, and have a good rest of your day.
You too. Stay safe.
I hope that you enjoyed that conversation between Ellen and I, and even in re-listening to that conversation, I've once again got excited about that intersection of sketchnoting and writing. So keep an eye out for upcoming verbal to visual projects that live at that intersection. It might have to wait until the start of next year because we've got quite a bit going on right now, but we will get there. Speaking of what's going on right now, if you'd like to dig deeper into the development of your sketchnoting skills and get access to one-on-one coaching calls like you heard Ellen and I just have, then check out Verbal to Visual's online classroom. There you'll find specific sketchnoting courses to help you develop your skills in a given area, and you'll also find the Verbal to Visual community, an opportunity for ongoing support with new prompts each week and a monthly mastermind to chat about whatever sketchnoting project you're working on and identify some next steps to help you keep moving forward. You can find more info about those resources at verbaltovisual.com, and then just add a /2 if you want to get to the show notes for this specific episode. I hope that our conversation today helps you identify a few ways that you might use sketchnoting elements alongside other forms of communication to share impactful ideas with others. Thank you so much for listening. If you're enjoying these first few episodes here, I do encourage you to leave a ratings and review on your podcast app of choice. That will help other visual thinkers make their way to this show and learn from these free-form conversations that I've really been enjoying. So if you have the time to leave a quick rating and review, that would mean a lot to me. Thanks again for listening. Good luck with whatever sketchnoting work you're engaged in right now, and we'll talk again soon. Till next time.